Hello, everyone. My name is Alex, and I'll be chairing this poster session. I hope everybody can hear me well. So our poster session will cover themes ranging from carbon sequestration, mitigation, and the importance of ensuring local benefits, local leadership, as well as challenges, successes, and learning lessons to scaling up nature-based solutions to deliver benefits for people and nature. And we also have a chance here to reflect on limitations in how NbS is understood and conceptualized, particularly in relation to monitoring and evaluation. And we'll have a presentation on this. This is particularly important to develop an evidence base that supports transformative nature-based solution processes. So today, I believe we have 4 poster presenters online, and we'll start by covering case studies focusing on different elements of what makes an effective solution. I won't introduce the speakers, and they each have 8 minutes. And then we'll have a bit more room at the end to address some questions. So Suma, if you are online, please go ahead and share your screen. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes. Can you all see my poster?
Yes.
All right.
Perfect.
Okay. Am I good to go now?
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Suma, and I'm a 4th-year PhD student at the University of Sheffield. My larger research focuses on the impacts of woodland creation on carbon sequestration and livelihoods in the Peak District. But today I'm going to be speaking on spaces of participation in woodland creation using a Peak District case study. So woodland creation has been proposed to be an effective nature-based solution in the UK to satisfy the net zero goals. And rewilding in the UK also encompasses natural regeneration and tree planting in addition to wildlife reintroductions as a nature-based solution for land management. In the Peak District, a scenario, several rewilding pilot programs have been established recently, which are in the pilot phase. And I'm using the Thornhill rewilding program, which is led by the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, as a case study. So speaking of the Thornhill rewilding program, it is a rewilding program led by the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, who also work along with the local communities in the Peak District, focusing on woodland creation and also engaging people with nature. I'm going to focus on, my study focuses on using concepts from social theory to understand woodland creation practice or rewilding practice, and wherein I focus on the power relationships between different stakeholders, which plays out in implementing rewilding. To begin with, I use something called the structuration theory to understand the power relations between stakeholders. So I conceptualize power based on the interactions between structure and agency. So structure is the rules and resources that's in place, which are available to the 2 stakeholders, based on which they draw power, or they derive power. And agency is the ability of the actors to make decisions based on their free will. So in my case study, the Derbyshire Wildlife Trusts draws on power using allocative or material resources. So these are the resources available to them, such as policy, funding, and access to infrastructure, and also access to land or land availability. And they draw on authoritative resources or non-material resources, such as knowledge and their position within the Peak District scenario, based on which they derive some power. The local community group, which is based at Hope Valley in Thornhill, draws on non-material power by their position of being local to that area, and also by building on their networks. Using these resources that's available to them, I characterize the two stakeholders as as relatively powerful and less powerful stakeholders. In this case, the powerful stakeholder is the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, and the less powerful stakeholder is the local community. So both these stakeholders draw upon policies, which is a structure to implement woodland creation, but they're also limited by funding, which is also another structure or resource that is available to them, which limits their agency to effectively carry out rewilding activities. Speaking about the forms of power, and so the visible forms of power are in the form of policies, rules, and practices. There are also invisible forms of power which take shape in the form of narratives and discursive power, which I'm not focusing on in this talk. And there are also spaces of power, spaces in which the participants operate, which are also influenced by the power relations. So these spaces could be opportunities, mediums, or channels which the stakeholders make use of to interact. And in the case of Thornhill, the less powerful actors have invited the powerful actors to participate in virtual meetings, and as well as interact with them on site at Thornhill to form informal partnerships. And they have also been, the local community has also been invited by the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust to take part in policy consultations, which we call as invited spaces. So some findings from my case study: the invited spaces where the less powerful actors get a role to participate, uh, and woodland creation is also restricted by funding, which is a structure, but also driven by recent policies. So where we can say policy as a structure enables, but funding as a structure constrains the agency of the stakeholders. And the willingness for woodland creation or rewilding is largely driven by incentives. So, but funding decisions happen in closed spaces where not all stakeholders can participate. So this surely impacts the level to which rewilding or woodland creation can be practiced in the case of Peak District. So with that, I end my talk. Thank you so much, and apologies for the technical error.
No, not a problem. I think we caught the, I think the main messages were clear, and we'll have an opportunity to summarize this afterwards. That was very interesting. I'll leave the floor to Carrie now to give her poster presentation, please.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Alex. And thanks so much for everyone who's presented in the first session, and Suma. It's been so interesting already to hear the presentations so far. So my name is Kerry Youngs, and I'm the Communities and Communications Lead at MCC Environmental based in Australia. So I'm presenting today on behalf of my co-researchers, Britt Basel from Ecotropic and Dr. Joanna Johnson from C2O Pacific Consulting. So there is an increased focus on the Pacific region due to its leadership in the climate change, adaptation and mitigation space. And to help address that, we're seeing significant funds coming in to support NbS projects. So to assist with the coordination and targeting of these funding streams, our research started to dig a little deeper to find out what gaps, lessons learnt and opportunities there might be for NbS projects in this region. So the project was funded through the Climate Resilient by Nature program, which is administered by WWF Australia, and it was funded by the Australian government. To gather the results, we undertook multiple workshops, interviews, online surveys, and a literature review from late 2021 to April this year. And just before I get into the results, just to note, when interpreting those results, we initially focused on 9 representative Pacific Island countries and territories, but this was broadened as we conducted the research to also include any multi-country initiatives that were identified. So now to the interesting part, the results. So overall, we identified 96 NbS projects. So it was a significant increase to a similar study that was conducted in 2019, which identified 31 NbS projects. So I guess it shows just how much interest there is in the NbS space and how much this is increasing in a short amount of time. So geographically, the results, as you can see from the map here on the slide, showed a really strong focus on Melanesia, in particular Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands and PNG, with Micronesia and the smaller remote islands really underrepresented in terms of the number of NbS projects being conducted. So to try and determine what was driving this disparity, we analysed the results against factors such as population, GDP, island type, and climate vulnerability, but we found no clear correlation with any of those. So anecdotally, talking to the participants in the project, it felt that this was primarily driven by a number of factors, including donor relationships with different countries, the knowledge and relationships of project designers and NGOs with key countries, and also the increased time and cost associated with engaging with more remote locations. We also found that NRM style projects, so that includes community-based fisheries projects and agriculture, were identified as the focus of most of the projects. And you can see as well that this was supported by the terrestrial agriculture habitats and mangrove and inshore habitats being the habitats that had the most number of projects recorded as well. So these results raised a number of really interesting implications for NbS in the Pacific, and some of those have got no really easy answers. So geographically, there's the opportunity to build on some of those countries where there is now the capacity in the government and organisations and achieve some really large-scale change with more NbS projects. But we also need to consider the areas that aren't currently getting much focus, and particularly how more remote locations can be better targeted. So limiting or having carefully considered conditions could also be a really key tool to ensure that funds are channeled appropriately. And finally, the role of the private sector and coordination between donors and NGOs and the private sector was seen as a really huge opportunity that was really currently underutilised in places across the Pacific at present. But there were some easier answers to build on when designing individual NbS projects. So while the IUCN NbS standards, as we've just heard from the first session, represents a really useful global framework, it was really clear that from the feedback that to ensure the success of NbS projects, the approach could not be generalised. So the Pacific nations are really diverse. So they range from high volcanic islands to tiny atolls, and the cultures and customs are really just as diverse as the geography. So it's really surprising that these countries are really often lumped into a single bucket and a one-size-fits-all approach to NbS projects is applied. So this approach has seen some projects not achieve the level of success that they could have. And there was really strong feedback that the design of NbS projects must be tailored to the specific characteristics of the location where they will be implemented. So not even like nation by nation within the Pacific, but community by community to consider the massive diversity that exists within single islands in terms of culture, geography, resource use and capacity. However, there were two key things that were agreed were key to the success of NbS projects in any Pacific island country, and that was designing projects around traditional knowledge and community participation. Many felt that at the moment, these factors were only considered in a really tokenistic way and not truly driving the project design and management. Now, to achieve that, we need to think about the funding arrangements. So we need to look at longer timeframes being allowed for both at the design stage and then during the actual completion of projects. And this really allows communities to own the projects, and traditional knowledge can be considered alongside Western scientific data from the start of the project. And of course, time costs money. So it's really important to ensure that project budgets reflect this also, and sufficient funding is allowed for. Now you can see on the poster here that many other factors were flagged as being key to consider in the design of NbS projects in the Pacific, relating to the alignment of government frameworks and local situations, achieving projects at scale, and also the long-term sustainability of projects. Now, the poster represents just a really brief summary of the results and the implications of the work. And I really encourage you to look either at the more detailed information sheet that is available, or the full copy of the report that you can download from the Climate Resilient by Nature website by following the QR code on this poster. I'd like to thank again the Australian Government and WWF Australia for supporting this work. We really hope that it proves valuable as each of the nations in the Pacific continue their leadership in managing the impacts of climate change. And it'll be really exciting to see how this work is built on to tailor the global standards to each of the many unique ecosystems and communities that exist in this region. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was wonderful. Some very important lessons there on scaling up nature-based solutions. And I really hope we'll get a chance to speak about this in a bit. I'd like to next open up the floor to Natalia, and who is coming to us from Ukraine, to speak about the NbS for resilience and addressing multiple, often intersecting challenges. And I will let her get into it, but I do want to express my sympathy for the current situation. And we're all thinking closely about our Ukrainian friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to the previous speakers. Okay, can you see everything? Is it good? Okay. Good afternoon again to everybody. My name is Natalia Pustilnik. I represent WWF Ukraine. And today I would like to talk a bit about our biggest pain, the war in Ukraine, but also about our biggest hope, how nature-based solutions can help us to achieve future security and disaster risk reduction. So Russia's war against Ukraine has posed a set of new unprecedented challenges for our society. Loss of human lives, destruction of housing and infrastructure, occupation of territories, and abduction of harvest in those territories, migration, economic recession. But in addition to these immediate challenges, there are environmental problems that we'll have to deal with for decades. And they are becoming more and more severe with every day of war and destruction. Our soils and water are contaminated with explosives, heavy metals, chemical warfare agents from munition residues, mines, and other explosive remnants of war. Our agricultural fields suffer from physical damage from shelling. Our forests, shelter belts, and protected areas are destroyed due to intended or unintended fires. Yet we believe that nature-based solutions can be a potential way to solve these environmental problems caused by the war. And they will help us to rebuild social ecological systems based on the principles of resilience. I would like to say that we are not military experts or soldiers. We are environmentalists, and we see how nature helps us and suffers in this war. And we think about ways to be grateful to her and help her recover and be our companion in the future. So rivers and wetlands, forests and shelter belts become important fortifications during the war, so-called military NbS. But they are getting destroyed just like buildings, bridges, and roads. And they can be revived and become our nature-based solutions in the post-war restoration for our future security, for climate adaptation, and for disaster risk mitigation. And today I would like to share with you just some examples of nature-based solutions in forest, water, and agriculture sectors that are the key focus of our project in Ukraine. Ukraine is a country with low sufficiency in water resources, and during the war, rivers and other wetland ecosystems are damaged because of the destruction of shores and infrastructure and because of the pollution by toxic elements from military equipment and that was trapped or sunk in the water bodies. And potential nature-based solutions for cleaning the water of these substances is the restoration of small rivers, especially their floodplains, the riparian zones and meanders. And restored rivers will also help us in the future for disaster risk reduction, as it will serve as a freshwater source and as a thriving habitat for species. As this spring events showed, free-flowing rivers can be a natural barrier for the enemy. For example, the flooding of a river near Kyiv helped to save millions of lives. Forests can be a nature-based solution as they can mitigate climate change. Yet about 20% of Ukrainian forests are now in the zone of military operations. Most of them in eastern and southern Ukraine, in the grassland zone. So these forests in the grassland zone, they are represented by monocultures of fast-growing pines. And these forests are most vulnerable during the war, as they can easily catch fire even from the smallest spark. And this fire can spread to thousands of hectares, killing all the living organisms. But what if we replace this monoculture forest with diverse and resilient forests that have an uneven aged tree structure and low density of stands? These forests can be our allies in mitigating climate change, and they can be more resilient to fires, pests, and climate change impacts in the future. In addition to forests, Ukraine has about 350 hectares of shelter belts, and it is our biggest nature-based solutions in agriculture. These shelter belts help to improve land productivity, prevent wind and water erosion, and create favorable microclimate conditions, and generally increase the resilience of agricultural landscapes. Right now, they also serve as natural fortifications among vast open plains of arable land. They are used as a cover, as a defensive and attacking position by the military. And in this process, they are being destroyed. So our goal is to increase the area of shelter belts and double it for future protection and for climate adaptation, nature restoration, and for food security. Restoration of agricultural landscapes in Ukraine in general plays an important role for global food security. According to preliminary estimates, up to 30% of agricultural fields on the territories where active military actions take place are damaged by shelling. And this number continues to grow with every day of warfare. The size of a shell hole can reach up to 6 meters in width and 10 meters in depth. Just take a moment to imagine it. So all these fields will require recultivation. But instead of just evening out the ground surface, farmers could create nature islands on these places, small tree patches, hedgerows, or wetlands to improve the general diversity of a very uniform Ukrainian landscape. The other benefits that farmers will enjoy are also significant. Erosion prevention, improved microclimate, biological pest control, increased soil fertility, carbon sequestration, decreased chemical pollution, and aesthetic value. And people will enjoy healthy and nutritious food. And for us, Ukrainians, restoration of fields also has a symbolic meaning of resistance and revival after the aggression. So when we started our project, of course, we couldn't have imagined the challenges that we'll have to deal with. But for all of us at WWF Ukraine, our partners and stakeholders in the Ensure project, the goal stays the same. It's to integrate nature-based solutions into Ukrainian policy for climate resilience and post-war restoration. We do this by developing a roadmap for NbS implementation in forestry, water, and agriculture. And in January, just before this war started, we created a common dream vision to which we commit still. It's a thriving, nature-positive, carbon-neutral, and climate-resilient Ukraine where natural resources are protected, restored, and sustained. I want to thank you for this opportunity, and let's work together to make this dream come true. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. We want to thank you for putting in the time to share this with us in these difficult moments. That was a deeply moving presentation, and highlighting very important aspects And I also want to express my my thoughts around, and WWF Ukraine and how it's been impacted by this conflict. So thank you. And next up we have Diego, who will speak to us about the perceptions of NbS practitioners in relation to the conceptualizations of nature-based solutions and monitoring and evaluation. But I will let him get right into it, and then we'll have a chance to have a little chat. So go ahead, the floor is yours, Diego. Thank you.
No, thank you, Alex, and thank you for the invitation. So, okay, can you see my screen? Don't worry, I'm gonna do zoom in and zoom out.
Perfect.
So first of all, my name is Diego Portugal del Pino. I'm a nature-based solution consultant for also WWF. But I'm Peruvian, and along with my colleague Jonathan Fredrickson, we elaborate this scientific report that is called Complementary Ideas for the Implementation of Nature-Based Solutions. The idea of this scientific report, which we submitted last week, was to, we observed some gaps while talking to practitioners. We observed some gaps between what they're doing and what we're seeing in the gray and scientific literature. So that was sort of the motivation to do this report. And we wanted to find this, how we can close this implementation gap if what the practitioners are doing are aligned to this great and scientific literature, it's not aligned, or there's complementary ways that it can be improved. So we use IUCN and European Commission theoretical framework as a baseline to see this comparison. And we use a questionnaire to compile the perceptions of all of the practitioners. We asked 211 practitioners, but we only get 66 responses. And you can see here like where the practitioners come from. Mainly they were from Latin America. In the survey, we asked like questions about especially 4 main gaps that we took into account by doing a literature review. Now, these 4 main gaps were mainly for implementation gaps. So there's other types of gaps that were not particular of interest for this study. So the 4 main ones that we've seen is like, okay, nature-based solutions are, first one, nature-based solutions are a solution to a problem, and IUCN call it societal challenge. But our practitioners implemented the projects to a societal challenge or mainly to a local challenge. The second one is the measurability and effectiveness of interventions. If practitioners are tracking their interventions, or which ways are they tracking their interventions, which indicators are they using. The third one is alignment with transformational governance processes. And this includes aspects of accountability, inclusivity, collaboration and synergies, policy alignment. And last but not least is the understanding of trade-offs. Yeah, I know that academia has a lot of information of trade-offs, but do practitioners really understand trade-off in a different variety of ways? So IUCN, the Commission of Ecosystem Management of IUCN, gave a list of 5 different trade-offs, and we wanted to know if practitioners are aligned or are identified of these types of trade-offs or only a couple. So to go with the results, our results show that there were some alignment with the theoretical framework mainly, but there was also some gaps and ways that it can be improved. And here's where we propose 5 complementary ideas. The first one is the framing of priorities. Manuel Pulgar Vidal mentioned that nature-based solutions has to address a societal challenge. And this is also what IUCN mentioned. But we have to see societal challenges as they are global challenges. And they might not always be linked to global challenges. And this is what happened in this case, where practitioners identified 29 local challenges. And by looking through the literature, there's also a lot of authors that mention that by putting different scales of prioritization, like from local to global, the outcome to have a successful NbS can be even better. So one of our first ideas was to to use both local and societal challenges that can complement each other. The second one is the need for quantitative and qualitative indicators. Most practitioners were using indicators, but there's a general mismatch of what types of indicators they are using. And everybody likes to have number of quantitative indicators. So they use a lot the IUCN and global standard, but even practitioners that use the global standard complemented with other quantitative indicators like the World Bank, DEFRA tools, the SDGs, etc. So one of the conclusions is that there's a need to consider both quantitative and qualitative indicators that can measure or track progress towards intervention. The third aspect is a bit more complicated, and it's called, it mentioned like consider plural evaluation for transformative NbS. So this is really broad, but I'm just gonna go to a main idea. So nature-based solutions are solutions to whom? They have to provide benefits to all stakeholders. They have to recognize the view of all your stakeholders, and they have to involve all your stakeholders in the decision-making process. And in our study, the practitioners were aligned to this, but they were not able to include or recognize the view or include all the stakeholders in the decision-making process. So we realized there's a difference between bringing stakeholders to the table and actually have a transdisciplinary outcome in which they recognize all the views and the rights of all parties. In order to do this, we propose like to use a plural evaluation as a pathway to transformative NbS governance process. The fourth one is addressing the systemic environment of NbS. This is pretty straightforward. Vanessa Perez already also mentioned about this, but the idea that I wanted to get about this is like, even though a practitioner might have all the goodwill in the world to implement a high quality success NbS, if the structural barriers are not addressed, the possibility to have a positive outcome might be severely compromised. So it's important to consider this also from this point of view of practitioners. And the last one, last but not least, is the identify different types of trade-off. There were certain trade-offs that were more common, that are more used in different fields, like in economics, for example, temporal trade-off, short-term, long-term profits, but also biophysical trade-off is one of the most cited in literature. And practitioners recognize both of these types. But there's other three types of trade-off that are more elusive, and I call them neglected trade-off. And these are like the governance ones. For example, local versus Western knowledge, the power imbalance of stakeholders, which Alex was mentioning. Also, another one is the scale of trade-off. Like I already mentioned the local versus global priorities. And the last one is cost and benefits. So if we're talking about ecosystem services, everybody wants ecosystem services and measure in economic terms. But what about the cultural ecosystem services? Those are usually left behind. Interesting enough is that all these three types of trade-offs share a root in not recognizing the rights, views, and priorities of marginalized stakeholders. So we encourage to expand our knowledge also on trade-off. So with all these 5 ideas in mind, we put these 5 ideas that can complement and possibly close the implementation gap. I have to say, just to close, that most of these topics in the context of nature-based solutions are not well studied, for example, especially plural evaluation. It's a lot of scientific literature on plural evaluation, but not so much yet on NbS. So further studies need to be done. And thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Diego. That was a very interesting presentation, which complements the others very well, I think. So what I'll do is I'll very, very quickly summarize the presentations, and we'll leave the floor to the participants. I just want to highlight, the first cross-cutting theme here is the importance of focusing on power differentials and power relations. Suma mentioned that in relation to the implementation of woodland in the Peak District, and Diego mentioned that in relation to also in relation to the implementation of nature-based solutions. Power differentials can affect the extent to which stakeholders key to the implementation of NbS can engage with authorities. And so, yeah, and also I think another important theme is the fact that, you know, who gets to decide where the funding is allocated. A lot of these decisions are in closed spaces, and stakeholders that can be key to the implementation of nature-based solutions, not least indigenous peoples and local communities, may not be in those very spaces where decisions are made. Then we heard about scaling up nature-based solutions in the Pacific with some very important lessons, notably the fact that there is no silver bullet, no generalizable blueprint for scaling up nature-based solutions. The key, I think the important theme here is that the key to scaling up nature-based solutions and ensuring that whatever is implemented is in tune with the local social and the local ecological context. So we do need to understand, you know, general trends in what drives and the scaling up of nature-based solutions, while recognizing that we cannot just jump in a particular place and expect to be implementing a replica of something that was implemented elsewhere. And then we heard about nature-based solutions for resilience and addressing multiple intersecting crises, including war, which leads to serious environmental problems, which in turn have important consequences for people, and therefore nature, through nature-based solutions, can be an ally in helping countries recover from disastrous impacts, be it war, but also in the context of the COVID recovery, and we need to recognize that. And yes, finally, Diego mentioned several important themes, the issue of scale. So how are societal challenges conceptualized? Are they conceptualized from the local perspective or the global perspective? The fact is both are important, but ultimately nature-based solutions have to respond to global societal challenges while being framed around the needs and perspectives of local communities and not those of external stakeholders. That is fundamental to the effectiveness of nature-based solutions. And yeah, there is an important need to address structural barriers. And so first and foremost, we need to recognize what those might be, whether it's corruption or limited government capacity or the limited agency of a particular stakeholder. Yes, and finally, trade-offs, keeping in mind that there are trade-offs between stakeholders, as well as trade-offs in relation to biophysical outcomes, and they do intersect as well. So I'll start off with just checking. Yeah, there are a few questions I want to ask. I think I'll start with Suma, since Suma presented first. And one question I want to ask Suma is what her perspective is on the role of farming communities in scaling up rewilding, which is an important topic here in the United Kingdom. Yeah, what is the role of farming communities, given the fact that there are mixed perspectives on the role or potential of rewilding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so from my interactions, what I've seen is most of Peak District is farmed. So it is very important to get these stakeholders on board, but it largely depends on how rewilding is framed, because there are other projects in which the farmers have volunteered or initiated woodland creation, but not so much under the tagline of rewilding. So I think there needs to be more consultations or communications and putting the message across as to what rewilding means for woodland creation in Peak District. But equally, again, farmers are also largely motivated by the incentives that they get paid for carrying out woodland creation. So again, it comes back to this question of how much money is allocated as incentives under the different schemes. But yeah, there have been initiatives from some small landholders and private landholders who have been trying out woodland creation on a smaller scale in the Peak District. But on a larger scale, I think most of the farming community members are still not okay with the tagline of rewilding, but are okay with woodland creation under other names.
Yeah, right. So the perceptions associated with the term is important, and there are different perspectives, and that matters for scaling up these solutions. And in terms of scaling up, actually, I want to go to Carrie's presentation because it was quite informative to start understanding, what is essentially driving the implementation of nature-based solutions, and we heard of these findings from the analysis in the Pacific. So knowing that nature-based solutions that are currently taking place across a variety of contexts, I'm wondering, Carrie, if you think the findings of your research, to what extent are your findings essentially unique, to the region of the Pacific?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Look, I think they're not unique at all to the Pacific, particularly where there are similar small island nations in other parts of the world. We would find, I think, very similar results to what we found for the Pacific area. They face the same challenges in terms of remoteness. Some of the cultural differences might be quite different for the Pacific context, but otherwise some of the challenges would be quite similar. I think it comes back to what you said, Alex, in that there's some guiding level principles that we can take away from research such as this that are applicable to all countries and projects around the world. But it's all about, I guess, taking that guiding level principles and making them specific to the local context.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, bridging the local and the global, and making sure that the principles are applied in a context-specific way. Thank you. Yeah, that's very informative. I found it very interesting to highlight as well. Yeah, your point about the remoteness of particular communities and how that affects the extent to which projects are implemented. I want to. Yeah, I want to stick to in relation to Natalia's talk. I want to ask her. So you mentioned a variety of different nature-based solution approaches. You mentioned, for example, the importance of considering biodiverse ecosystems within nature-based solutions, highlighting the fact that monoculture stands of grasslands as well as tree plantations were much less resilient to the impact of war. And I will note that that's also very much the case when it comes to fire risk as the climate warms. But what are the most promising nature-based solutions from your perspective in relation to post-war restoration, Natalia?
Yes, thank you for that question. As I mentioned, yeah, there are of course multiple ones, and we shouldn't consider just one. But I could say from my side, as I'm a bit more involved in agriculture and NbS, I think that we could use, of course, this is a horrible situation that we have to face, but now facing that we have a lot of land, agricultural lands, which are damaged from war. As I said, it could be up to 30% in some regions. This is a chance to make sure that we have, we will need to recultivate them in any way. So we have to make sure that we revive them for sustainable nature positive food production in the future, because there is no point in going back to the old system of food production, which actually is very important for global food security, as we unfortunately now have to face. But it was coming at a very high cost for Ukrainian biodiversity. And given also the historical conditions, which is a lot of arable land in Ukraine, one of the third largest number of arable land, with every year we lose soil, we lose our biodiversity by exporting these huge amounts of grains. So this could be an opportunity, after proper assessment, of course, to assess and set aside some of the maybe degraded lands or damaged lands from the war for the nature. So this is of course, a restoration approach, a restoration nature-based solution. In some cases, it could be for forests, for woodlands, for wetlands. but it also could be in the southeast of Ukraine for pastures and grasslands for sustainable meat production, for example, because again, historically, this is a landscape which was grassland and steppes. And now it's in the future, given the climate prediction scenarios, it would make sense to restore this landscape or part of it to grassland pastures and sustainable maybe meat production. And but of course, I would also just to mention this other challenges that people mentioned, the involvement of communities and farmers or businesses and the government. I think if you talk about landscape approaches to nature-based solutions or nature-based solutions that require to be implemented on the landscape level, it is important to have this triple approach. So government should provide the vision and guidance. Farmers and communities should be, of course, involved at the very all stages. So we shouldn't forget about the strategic role of government, communities, and farmers and businesses.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if I'm not mistaken, that's in part what is meant by this whole society approach, right? The term, a term I've used, I've heard being used by WWF. So we need, we do need structures high up, but we also need bottom up approaches, and it's about the merger of both. But it's not just top down or purely bottom up. I think is the theme here, and in relation to ensuring that nature-based solutions adequately address not only food production, but also, of course, biodiversity, and because they are fundamentally biodiversity based. No, thank you. That was very interesting. You said that 30% of lands, I'm just going to stick on that point, if I may, 30% of lands in Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, are affected by war. Was that, how did that figure come about? How are we able to say that?
Yes, sorry, it's 30% in some regions which are most directly affected by active military operations now. So it's Eastern Ukraine, Southern Ukraine, and it's very preliminary estimates. Like the margin of mistake could be quite large because there is, of course, no yet large-scale satellite assessments of how much land is actually damaged. But it could be up to 30% from certain percentage, which we don't know. And it includes like physical damage, but also contamination. So it's kind of all of these things combined. But yeah, as we saw maybe you saw from the picture, some of the fields are quite heavily shelled. Like for the first picture on the presentation, just showed like whole field in these shell holes. So yeah, we cannot, I am afraid we cannot use this number as like official yet, but assessments are underway, and yeah, we will hope we'll come up with it later.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm very interested in, in the future to see how the recovery will play out, and how the extent, not only the extent to which nature will be considered in the recovery itself, but also, what the various perspectives of Ukrainians are around how to scale up nature-based solutions in Ukraine. What should the focus be on? You mentioned the issue of agriculture and perhaps transitioning at least some of the agriculture towards more biodiversity-friendly and sustainable forms of food production. So that'll be a very interesting space. We have a few minutes left, and I do want to ask Diego, excuse me, if he's aware of other gaps, broadly speaking. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you're referring to, in part, gaps between, the literature on nature-based solutions, including the scientific, or the more broadly, the research literature, but gap versus how implementers are thinking about nature-based solutions and implementing them. So I'm wondering if there are other quote unquote gaps that you might be aware from your personal experience.
Yes, thanks for the question, Alex. Okay, yes, there were some of the response gave mainly financial gaps. They cannot implement NbS if they don't have money. And the other thing is they were, for example, a lot of the standards asked them to monitor their intervention often in a lot of life cycles of the project. But also they were mentioning that this costs a lot of money. And most projects do not have the resources to have a thorough monitoring throughout the different stages of the project. So I think this is a big gap. The other one is what I read is called human capital, that the know-how to do nature-based solutions is lacking. So a lot of people wanted to do the NbS, but they didn't know exactly how to do it, and they need some sort of guidance, especially also on hybrid and nature-based solutions. If we consider engineers, they want to go for hybrid and nature-based solutions, combining natural and gray infrastructure, but they only know their gray infrastructure, not so much about the other one. And the last one is it's sort of related to technology gap, that there's limited of resources in some areas, and there's the impossibility to provide like a hybrid NbS. For example, last week I was in a workshop and they mentioned that the most cost-effective NbS is hybrid ones. And people are looking to do this, but they don't have the resources or also the expertise to do it. And if I can answer in 1 minute some of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, 1 minute is okay, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Okay. About plural evaluation. I'm just going to mention that plural evaluation is an interesting aspect for NbS, because you have to have a transdisciplinary outcome. That means that there might be some ideas from the design of your intervention that might compromise the outcome. And this is actually like a really good paper by one of your colleagues, Alex, Stephen. He has yes, he has a really good paper about this, saying that when we gather the perception of all the stakeholders, there might be other priorities above the NbS, and the possibility to implement the NbS might be compromised. So this is like a risk. And on the question that it was about quantitative, the most common one were like quantitative indicator for climate change mitigation and biodiversity loss. But if you want some reference tools, the World Bank for flood mitigation, it was well referenced by a lot of practitioners.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, indeed, the World Bank has a set of principles and guidelines to help scale up nature-based solutions. I think particularly in the context of flooding. The issues you mentioned, and I'll just quickly wrap up as we're pretty much done, but the issues you mentioned in relation to, number one, allocating enough funds for monitoring and evaluation, and number two, the capacity gaps, if you will, in terms of the skills and so forth, the knowledge and the skills in terms of how to design and implement nature-based solutions, whether it's a nature-based solution or a nature-based solution in hybrid with hard infrastructure, hence the term hybrid solutions. We found these themes to be very important in the United Kingdom in terms of scaling up nature-based solutions for adaptation. And we'll have a session, which is session 8B, to talk about that. Thank you. I think I thought I was being cut off, but no. Yeah, so that's session 8B, and that'll be on Thursday. So thank you, everyone. I want to thank all the participants, and please stay tuned for the next session, which is starting shortly, on defining nature-based solutions. Thank you.